Growing up in a suburb in the 90s, I did a lot of bike riding around the neighborhood with my friends. Over time, and as we inevitably went through growth spurts, a lot of bikes cycled through the group. But one brand that was always in the mix was Mongoose. When I hit my teens, I got more into mountain biking and quickly found my department store bike just didn't cut it. I ended up with a specialized rock hopper, and after that purchase, I didn't really hear that much about Mongoose. Fast forward to just a few months ago, and I got an email asking if I'd be interested in trying out a new bike from them, the Switchback Expert. They promised modern geometry, a super capable ride, and everything you'd need to tackle your local mountain bike trails, all for under $700. I've now ridden this bike on everything from rail trails to Black Diamond single track with 3 different forks and even a couple of different handlebars. So, has Mongoose delivered on their promise of a wallet-friendly modern hardtail? Let's get into it. The Switchback Expert, at least in this iteration, is a model specific to Dick's Sporting Goods. There's also a lower spec version they sell called the Comp, which has the same geometry, with the only difference in the frame being a straight head tube instead of the Expert's tapered. I was originally under the impression that the two also had different rear spacing, with the Comp being 135 QR and the Expert with Boost 141 QR. By under the impression, I really mean that the description actually lists the Expert as 141, but as it turns out, that must be a typo. My first clue here was that it lists the rear hub as a 135 hub, something I was able to confirm with some calipers and by testing a wheel from a 135 spaced bike. I'm honestly kind of happy with this, as there are a lot more options for 135 QR wheels and hubs out there, and it should make upgrading much easier. Moving on to more of the Expert specs, it comes with a 100mm SR Suntour coil fork, a 1x8 microshift drivetrain with a 42-tooth granny gear, internal dropper post routing, and a random brand of hydraulic disc brakes. The components are all about what you'd expect on the performance and reliability front, but having a 1x setup and hydraulic brakes is a little nicer than you'd usually see at this price point. One component that was a pleasant surprise was actually the wheels, which, despite not being tubeless ready or high engagement, stood up to a rider over 200 pounds smashing through rocks without a ding or a wobble to be seen. If you want a more in-depth overview of the specs, go check out my first look video, but the last thing I'll note is that the size small comes with 27.5 wheels and tires and a slightly shorter chainstay. Otherwise, it's all the same as the larger sizes. A lot of avid mountain bikers are going to dismiss this bike right away for 2 reasons: the components and the QR spacing in the rear. While components obviously play a major role in how well a bike performs, the QR side isn't as big of a deal as many people make it out to be. I fully acknowledge that through axles and boost spacing are superior in basically every way, but that doesn't mean that a bike with QR is unrideable or, not worth buying. What trumps both of these factors is geometry. All those measurements and angles that are at the heart of the fit, purpose, and capability of a bike. With a 66.5-degree head tube, 75-degree seat tube, 470 reach, 620 stack, 62 mils of bottom bracket drop, and an impressively low 706 standover for a size large, it's right on trend with modern bikes. So as much as I noticed the entry-level components while riding this bike, what stood out far more was the geometry. Whether it was a steep and techy descent, a single drop, or a fast and flowy jump line, the bike was stable and gave me a lot of confidence. I never got that falling forward or over the bars feeling, and was actually really impressed with how well it did on things like rock rolls and drops. It's not a super playful bike, mostly from that longish 445 rear end, so if you're looking for something to manual and whip through corners, you may be disappointed. That's okay though, because I don't think the use case they were going after here, and the 100mm fork is a good indicator of that. While you should never really look at geometry numbers in isolation, head tube angle is a really good indicator of what a bike's purpose is, and while 66.5 degrees might have been slack 10 years ago, it's borderline or even squarely in cross-country territory now. The short travel fork and longer chainstays line up really well with this geometry, as it makes the bike efficient and easy to handle on the climbs and flats, but still plenty capable on the descents. Unfortunately, a lot of the capability from the geometry is hindered by the super basic stock components. Luckily for you, I love to swap things around and see what I can do to upgrade a bike like this, so that's exactly what I did. The first change I made, and one I consider more of a preference than an upgrade, was the bars, which I swapped to some 50/50 bars that are 780 millimeters wide with 25 mils of rise. Coming in the low 700s and with a little tiny bit of rise, the stock bars aren't terrible, but they are narrower than what most riders are going to be used to. After riding for a while with this configuration, I then made the real upgrades by swapping to a 110mm Ren suspension fork and putting on a spare wheel I had set up tubeless with a 2.4-inch Maxxis Ardent. This change made a massive difference and made it ride like a much more expensive bike. Instead of tensing up when heading into rock gardens and drops, I was able to charge in confidently and let the front end kind of do its thing. The added travel and slightly slacker head tube were helpful here, but most of the difference was from a well-performing air fork instead of the low-end coil-sprung fork it had on there before. While that SR Suntour fork is going to be fairly reliable, performance-wise it just does not do that well. A tubeless tire up front was also nice because I could run lower pressures for more traction without worrying about pinch flatting or damaging the rim. It's something I wish I had been able to do on the rear, but I don't have any quality quick release wheels in my parts bin, so I couldn't test that out. I later stole the dropper post from my RSD Mare to see how that affected the bike's capability. The internal routing, something I usually hate, was actually one of the easier setups I've dealt with, and the whole process only took maybe 10 minutes from start to finish. The dropper gave all of the expected benefits from having your saddle out of the way, and was a lot nicer than having to manually raise and lower the post along the ride, which is what I had been doing. I think Mongoose missed here though on taking advantage of their super low top tube. I ran a 150mm dropper and didn't have as much room as you'd expect due to the seat tube sticking up so much. Had they kept it just slightly over the top tube, I think I would have been able to fit at least a 175 on there to get it even more out of the way. One other thing I did with the bike was set it up with a rigid carbon fork and some alternative bars meant mostly for bike packing. I didn't end up actually bike packing with it at all, but I wanted to test how versatile of a platform it could be. With only a single bottle cage location and no other mounts to be found, the Switchback isn't exactly designed for any sort of overnight or long-term travel. Then you add in that long reach, which is only made longer by a shorter rigid fork, and you'll quickly find that the only thing this really has going for it on the adventure front is that it's a hardtail. Even with the Ritchie Buzzard bars and their 70 mils of rise, I still felt stretched out and would get uncomfortable on any ride over a couple of hours. Going back to the keep the design in mind philosophy, the Switchback isn't designed or even advertised for long days in the saddle or carrying stuff, so I can't really fault it here. So as much as hardtails are usually great at being super versatile, geometry and mounting locations and tire clearance are where the true versatility resides. When Mongoose first reached out about reviewing this bike, my expectations were honestly pretty low. It's not because I don't believe a well-riding budget bike isn't possible, but my past experiences with them hasn't been great. It wasn't until I saw the geometry numbers that I thought the Switchback Expert could prove me wrong, and that's exactly what it did. I'm not saying this bike doesn't have its flaws. It sure does. But geometry is at the heart of a bike, and Mongoose did a great job on this one. It's modern and aggressive, but not so far as to be boring on greens and blues. It's also upgradable with a tapered head tube and dropper post routing. You might shudder at the thought of putting a $700 fork on a $700 bike, but if you're new to the sport, or you're on a tight budget, or maybe you're a young Nike rider trying to get better, that might be your best option. The drivetrain is geared way too high for where I live and my body weight, and the brakes are the definition of mediocre, but those are easy upgrades, and I'd still take the stock ones over a 2x7 and some cheap cable disc brakes. My point is that while this is definitely still an entry-level or a budget bike, it's a great candidate for upgrading as you go and progress. So while your skills might quickly surpass the capability and durability of the components, the frame is an awesome platform for starting and growing your mountain bike journey. If you want to learn more about this bike, I've dropped a link down in the description below where you're able to see everything on their website. You should also go check out my first look and ride video because I go over the specs a little more in depth there. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like, comment, and share it, and be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.